I've always been a fan of camping, escaping the noise of the city, disconnecting from the digital world and just being surrounded by nature. But after what happened to me and my friends in the mountains of Washington State, I don't think I'll ever go camping again. This happened about 3 years ago. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Lisa, and our other friend Eric. We had all been close since college, and we wanted one last adventure before Jake and Lisa moved out of state for new jobs. Jake suggested a weekend camping trip in a remote area he had read about. It was deep in the mountains, far from any marked trails, but he swore it had the best views and no crowds. We all agreed, no one likes a crowded campsite, right? We packed our gear, drove for hours into the wilderness, then hiked another 5 miles until we found the perfect spot. It was a wide clearing surrounded by towering trees with a small creek nearby for fresh water. It felt untouched, like no one had camped there before. We set up our tents, built a fire, and spent the evening laughing, roasting marshmallows, and sharing ghost stories. At one point, while we were sitting around the fire, Eric suddenly shushed us. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We all went silent. For a moment, all I heard was the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of water running in the creek. Then, faintly, I thought I heard something else, a rustling in the trees, like footsteps moving through the underbrush. "Probably just an animal," Lisa said, shrugging it off. We agreed and kept talking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Eventually, we all went to bed. My tent was closest to the trees, and as I lay there, I swore I heard faint whispering, too quiet to make out any words. I was probably just imagining it, I told myself. The wind, the trees, my mind playing tricks on me. But the next morning, everything changed. I was the first to wake up. The second I unzipped my tent, I froze. Everything was gone. The fire pit we built, gone. The logs we sat on, gone. Our food, our backpacks, even our tents, including the one I had just crawled out of, completely missing. The others woke up to me shouting. We stood there, stunned, looking around in disbelief. We were in the exact same clearing, but there was no sign we had ever been there. The only thing left was the indentation in the grass where our tents had been. "This has to be a joke," Jake muttered, rubbing his eyes. "Did one of you guys move our stuff?" We all denied it. Even if someone had wanted to prank us, how could they have done it without waking everyone up? Lisa pulled out her phone to check the time. "Dead," she said, frowning. We all checked ours. Dead. All 4 phones, fully charged the night before, were now completely drained. That's when the fear started setting in. No food, no water, no way to call for help, and miles away from civilization. We had no choice but to start walking back. At first, we tried to follow the path we had taken the day before, but nothing looked familiar. The trees all seemed off. They were taller, denser, almost like they were shifting around us. And then we saw the carvings. Deep scratches in the bark, crude symbols we didn't recognize. Some of them looked fresh, like they had been made just last night. "Guys," Eric said, his voice unsteady, "I think we're being followed." He pointed behind us. At first I didn't see anything, but then, through the trees, I saw a shadow. Tall, unmoving, watching. The second my eyes focused on it, it stepped behind a tree and disappeared. I felt my stomach drop. "We need to go," Lisa said. We picked up the pace. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our footsteps crunching leaves. Every so often, one of us would glance back and see a shape darting between the trees, always just far enough that we couldn't make out any details. By the time the sun started setting, panic was taking over. We had walked for hours, but we weren't any closer to getting out. That's when we saw it. Our campsite. Exactly as it had been the night before. The fire pit, the logs, the tents, all of it, like we had never left. Lisa started crying. No, we left this place." No one spoke. We were too scared to. Then we heard it, a deep, guttural whisper, close. You were never supposed to leave." I turned my head so fast it hurt. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure, tall. Too tall. Its limbs were long and unnatural, its face featureless except for two hollow black voids where eyes should be. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Then, suddenly, it twitched, like a glitch in reality, before sprinting toward us faster than anything I had ever seen. We ran blindly through the dark, crashing through trees and branches, not caring where we were going as long as it was away from that thing. At some point I tripped and fell. When I looked up, I saw dawn breaking through the trees. We had made it. We had reached the main trail. I scrambled to my feet, looking back one last time. The forest behind us was empty, silent. When we made it back to our car, we drove straight to the nearest town and went to the ranger station. We told them everything. They hiked back to our supposed campsite but found nothing. No tents, no footprints, no fire pit. It was like we had never been there. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't know why our entire campsite disappeared, or why something in that forest didn't want us to leave. But I do know one thing. A few weeks later, Lisa sent me an old newspaper article she had found online. In 1972, a group of 4 hikers vanished in the exact same area. Their bodies were never found. Their campsite was never found. And their last known words, written in a tattered journal recovered from the woods, were the same ones we heard that night. You were never supposed to leave. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, a chance to disconnect from the world, enjoy the fresh mountain air, and spend time with close friends. At least that's what we all thought when we planned the trip. But none of us were prepared for what happened in those woods. None of us were ready for the nightmare that unfolded. There were 4 of us: Jake, Lisa, Mark, and Eric. We had been friends since high school, and we made it a tradition to go on a camping trip at least once a year. This time we decided to explore a more secluded area, deep in the mountains. No cell service, no distractions, just us and nature. We parked our car at the trailhead and hiked for miles, finally setting up camp in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. The first night was perfect. We sat around the fire, telling ghost stories, roasting marshmallows, and laughing about how isolated we were. The stars above us were clear, and the crisp mountain air made everything feel surreal. But then things started feeling off. It began with strange noises in the distance. At first they were faint and noticeable over the crackling fire. It sounded like whispers, or maybe footsteps just beyond the tree line. We joked about it being animals, maybe even another group of campers. But in the back of my mind, something didn't feel right. When we woke up the next morning, everything was gone, and I mean everything. Our tents, backpacks, food, hell, even our shoes. It was as if we had never set up camp at all. The only things left were the clothes we slept in. At first, we thought it was a prank. Maybe some other campers are messing with us. But when we started looking around, we realized something was seriously wrong. There were no footprints, no drag marks, nothing. It was like our gear had just vanished into thin air. Panic started setting in. We had no supplies, no phones. They were missing too. We were miles from the car, deep in the wilderness with no idea what to do. Lisa, always the rational one, suggested retracing our steps back to the trailhead. It was our best option, but as we started walking, we noticed something even more disturbing. There were symbols carved into the trees, fresh carvings, yet unfamiliar, strange, jagged symbols that none of us recognized. They hadn't been there the day before. It felt like we were being warned. Or worse, marked. As we continued, an eerie silence settled over the forest. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of our own footsteps and the occasional rustling in the distance. And then Eric froze. "I saw something," he whispered. We all turned, but there was nothing there. "Behind the trees," he said. Something was watching us. Mark tried to brush it off, saying our minds were playing tricks on us, but I could see the fear in Eric's eyes. He wasn't lying. Night came faster than we expected, and without supplies, we were forced to make a shelter from branches and leaves. We huddled together, too scared to sleep. And then we heard it. Footsteps circling us, slow and deliberate, and those whispers. Closer now, almost mocking. Lisa wanted to leave, even in the dark, but Mark argued that moving without light would be more dangerous. We were stuck. That's when we saw it. Not a person, not an animal, something else. Tall, featureless, its hollow eyes staring directly at us. It moved in a way that was wrong, unnatural, its limbs elongated, twitching as it took slow, deliberate steps toward us. We ran, blindly, desperately. Through the darkness, through the trees, through the suffocating terror that gripped us. We didn't stop until we saw it, our campsite. Exactly as it had been before, tents standing, backpacks where we left them, like we had never left. A sickening realization hit us. Something had been playing with us. And then, a voice. Deep, guttural. You were never supposed to leave. The figure emerged from the shadows again, this time closer. Too close. We bolted. I don't remember how we found the main trail, only that as dawn broke we saw the familiar dirt path ahead. We ran until we reached the car, fumbling with the keys, speeding down the mountain road without looking back. When we returned with authorities later that day, there was nothing. No campsite, no signs we had ever been there. No footprints, just an empty forest. We never spoke about it again. But weeks later, Lisa found something. A missing persons report. A group had disappeared in that same area decades ago. Their campsite was never found. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear whispers. What if some places aren't meant to be found? And what if something in the woods doesn't just want to watch, but wants to take? The trip was supposed to be a peaceful getaway just a few days before my older brother Alex moved away for work. My younger sister, Emma, and I had always been close, and we figured a camping trip deep in the woods would be the perfect way to spend our last few days together before life pulled us in different directions. We drove up to a secluded forest that was far from civilization, surrounded by towering pines and dense underbrush. The campsite was tucked away in a quiet valley, the kind of place where your phone wouldn't get service and the world felt far away. The kind of place where you could forget about everything else and just be. We set up camp near a quiet clearing, the evening sun casting long shadows on the ground as we unpacked our gear. Emma and I had spent summers here as kids, and now, even though it had been years, the forest felt familiar. There was something calming about it, but at the same time, something a little eerie, like the trees themselves were watching us. By the time we had the campfire going, the sun had dipped below the horizon. We sat by the fire, laughing and reminiscing about old times. There was something bittersweet about it, knowing that Alex was about to leave. It wasn't a huge move, he was just going to a different city for work, but it still felt like the end of an era. The first night passed without incident. We stayed up late, enjoying the peace of the forest, only the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves filling the air. As we lay in our sleeping bags, I remember thinking that this would be a trip to remember. The second night, things started to change. We sat around the fire again, chatting and watching the flames flicker. The night felt heavier somehow, the air thick with an uneasy stillness. That's when we first noticed him. A man standing just outside the light of the fire, barely visible in the darkness. At first I thought it was just another camper, someone who had wandered too far from the main trail and stumbled into our campsite. It wasn't uncommon for people to get lost in the woods, especially after dark. But something about him didn't feel right. He wasn't moving, not a single twitch, not even the slight shifting of weight you'd expect from someone standing still. He just stood there, in the dark, staring into the firelight, with his face hidden in the shadows. "Hey," I called out, trying to break the silence. "You lost something?" No answer. Emma glanced at me, her brow furrowed, her unease palpable. "Maybe he's just shy," she suggested, though I could tell she wasn't convinced. Neither of us were. We tried calling out again, but still no response, no movement. The longer he stood there, the more unsettling it became. It was as if he didn't even hear us, or if he did, he didn't care. After a few minutes, we decided to ignore him, figuring he would leave if we just let him be. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself that he was probably just another camper who didn't want to interact. But the air felt wrong, like something was off. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't just another camper. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a primal kind of fear growing inside me, something I hadn't felt since I was a kid. The man never moved, at least not visibly. Every time I looked away and glanced back, he was just a little bit closer to the fire, closer to us. But still, there was no sound of him walking, no crunch of leaves beneath his feet. He was just there. "Alex, he's moving," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. I felt it too. The man was getting closer, and I had no idea how or why. He didn't make a sound. His movements were almost unnatural. I tried to keep calm, trying to brush it off. "He's probably just walking around," I said, but I didn't even believe my own words. We continued to sit by the fire, but neither of us could relax. Every time I glanced away and back again, the man was just a little closer. It was like he was gliding toward us, but there was no sound, no indication that he was moving at all. He wasn't walking. He wasn't even breathing. "Should we leave?" Emma asked, her voice shaking now. I could feel my own fear rising, but I didn't want to give in. I was the older brother. I should have been the one to protect her, to reassure her that everything would be fine. But nothing felt fine. "It's fine," I said, though my voice betrayed me. "We'll be okay. It's probably nothing." We sat there in silence, watching the fire flicker and crackle, but every so often I couldn't help but glance back at the spot where the man had been standing. Each time he was closer, closer to the fire, closer to us. Then, in an instant, he was gone. 1 second he was there just beyond the firelight, and the next there was nothing, no movement, no rustling of leaves, just empty space. We both froze, staring at the spot where he had been standing. The fire crackled, and the night seemed to swallow up the silence. I grabbed the flashlight, sweeping it around the campsite, but there was nothing. No sign of him, no trace that he had ever been there. "Where did he go?" Emma whispered. I didn't have an answer. I couldn't explain it. But I knew one thing. I didn't want to be out there anymore. We grabbed our things and made our way to the tent, not saying a word to each other. I zipped the flaps shut, and we huddled in the darkness, too afraid to speak. I kept the flashlight on, scanning the trees outside, but there was nothing. Just the cold, oppressive silence of the forest. We lay there, waiting for morning, both of us too scared to sleep. The night dragged on, every creak of the tent, every rustle of the wind outside making us jump. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no whispers in the dark, just the feeling of being watched. When the sun finally rose, we packed up quickly, barely speaking. We were both still rattled, but neither of us wanted to acknowledge what had happened. We just wanted to get out of there. On the way back home, Emma suggested we check the footage from the cameras we had set up around the campsite. At first, I didn't want to, but part of me knew we needed to know what had really happened. We pulled out the footage on Emma's phone. At first, it was just normal shots of the campsite, us sitting by the fire, laughing, setting up the tent. But then we saw it. The man. He wasn't standing still at all. As we watched the footage, we realized something horrifying. He wasn't walking. He wasn't moving normally. His body jerked and twisted in unnatural ways, crawling toward us but without a sound. His movements were quick and strange, like something that wasn't quite human. Sometimes he moved sideways, sometimes backward, but always silent. And then in one frame, I saw something that made my heart stop. He was inches away from the tent, his face still hidden in shadow, but there was something about it, something off. His face was blurred, like the camera wasn't supposed to capture it. The last frame showed our tent from the outside. The flap was zipped, the fabric stretched tight against the frame. But in that frame, there was something else. Something in the shadows. Something inside. I didn't need to see the rest of the footage to know what had happened. The man had been inside the tent. We hadn't heard him move. We hadn't heard anything, but he had been there, watching us. I've never been back to those woods, and I never will. Because whatever that thing was, whatever it was that moved without sound, without reason, it's still out there, waiting, and it knows where I am.